Creaking Wheel. A lean and hungry mouse once pushed his way through a small hole into a corn hutch. But when he would have returned by the same way, he found himself too plump. A weasel who had great fun. Listen, there is but one way to get out, and that is to wait till you have become as lean as when you first got in. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. It's Monday, February 27th. So it's time for us to study some of Aesop's fables. We'll likely get through 2 of the fables today. Let me just make sure everyone gets in okay. We'll go through 2 fables, and then if there's more time, we can look at more. If you have any questions, I can hang out for a little while after our talk ends and answer any questions you have, but let's just let everyone get settled in for today and we'll get rolling here. Again, it's Monday, February 27th, and we're going to get into some of Aesop's fables. Before we get started, let me just make a few rules. I don't want anyone chatting or sending messages, just chatting back and forth while we're going through lessons. You're supposed to be paying attention. And what I recommend is that you keep a sheet of paper handy, and as we go through these lessons, you jot down some notes so that you can then go and finish these lesson assignments once we're done with our meetings, and you can have a few notes about the main ideas we talked about, so you can remember things when it's time to complete your assignments. So the goal of these meetings is to help you move more quickly through Aesop's fables. There's if you're interested in connecting with other students and chatting and things like that, we created some forums. You could just go to classicalliberalaarts.com/forums and chat all you want. But here during these meetings, I want you to pay attention. Your parents have you on here so that you can get some help with your lessons and move through your lessons more quickly. So let's make sure we pay attention to what we're supposed to be paying attention to while we're in these meetings. All right, it looks like everyone's settled in. Can you give me a wave just to make sure audio is okay? Good. All right, great. So the two fables we're going to look at today, I'm going to share my screen. The first fable is called The Creaking Wheel. The Creaking Wheel, and I forget what number this is. We're down in the 87-ish or so, something like that. But the Creaking Wheel we'll read today and talk about, and then we'll look at the Mouse and the Weasel. So 2 fables. We'll take our time through these 2 fables, make sure we discuss all the details and talk about the applications a little bit. And then, like I said, if there's any time left, I can take any questions you have or look at another fable. If there's a fable that you've been struggling with, we can look at those fables. So let's get started with the Creaking Wheel. The Creaking Wheel, and let me know if anyone would like to read. Who'd like to read the fable for us today, the Creaking Wheel? All right, I've got Ezekiel and Jezreel saying me. I'm not sure which one is me, but I'll give you a shot here. I'm just going to ask you to unmute. So you should be able to unmute your microphone. There you go. Yep, I can hear you. So go ahead and read. Take your time and just read through it slowly, all right?
The Creaking Wheel. A coachman, hearing one of the wheels on his coach make a great noise, and perceiving that it was the worst one of the 4, asked it how it came to take such a liberty. The wheel answered that from the beginning of time, creaking had always been the privilege of the weak.
All right, thank you. Very short and simple. So we have this fable of the Creaking Wheel. Remember, the reason we're going over these is so you can get these assignments done easily. So like I said, you might want to jot some things down just so you remember later on. But we've got 4 or 5 questions that we answer for every one of these fables. And we want to make sure that we get each of those questions answered. I'm going to be strict with you guys, especially those of you who I know meet with me in these meetings. I'm going to be strict on the morals of the fables and on the applications. So make sure you're careful, because I'm going to be grading your work more strictly, because when we go over it, I know that you have no excuse. So pay attention and let's learn these fables so you can do well on these assignments and move along. So there's 5 questions we normally ask. The first one is, what's the title of the fable? That's the Creaking Wheel. Okay, very simple. Secondly, I ask you to paraphrase, and this fable is so short that it's almost difficult to paraphrase because it's so short. But the goal of a paraphrase is just to retell the story in your own words. All right, just retell the story in your own words. And the reason why I ask you to do that is there's two reasons. First, to make sure you've actually read it. And second, just to ask you to explain it to me in your own words. So you have to think about it a little bit and communicate it. So those are the two goals of asking you to paraphrase the fable. Just tell me the story in your own words and try to include all the details. And when we have a short fable like this, it's actually difficult to do that because you might as well just repeat the fable, and that's fine for a short one like this. The third question is when we get into the moral of the fable, and that's when it usually gets difficult. So let's think about this fable and identify the moral lesson of this fable. We have a coachman, a man who's driving a carriage, okay, a horse-drawn carriage. He's driving a carriage and it's got wheels on it, most likely made of wood. And as they're driving along, he hears a terrible noise. And so he looks around to try to figure out what this terrible noise is, and he realizes that it's one of the wheels on the coach making lots of noise. And so it says he asked the wheel how it came to take such a liberty. In other words, the coachman looks down at this noisy wheel and says, where do you think you get the right to make all this noise and interrupt, our traveling here? Why are you making so much noise? What right do you have to make all this noise? How do you have such liberty? How do you take such liberty? That's what it means. So the wheel responds and says, from the beginning of time, creaking had always been the privilege of the weak. Creaking is the privilege of the weak. Now, just to make sure you understand what a privilege is, because we have this word is important, what a privilege is. There's a difference between a privilege and a right, okay? A difference between a privilege and a right, and I'll give you an example. You have a right to life. So if someone threatens to take your life, you have a right to resist or to defend yourself. You have a right to protect your life. That's a right. A privilege is something that is given to you, but you don't have a right to it. And a good example of this would be a driver's license. Okay, when you get older and you're old enough to drive, you can get a driver's license from the state, and the state gives you permission to drive a car. And you're only allowed to drive a car if the state gives you permission. And your driver's license is a privilege. And the reason why it's a privilege and not a right is because if you don't follow the laws, the state can take your driver's license away from you. If you drive too fast, if you don't follow the rules, you don't pay attention to the signs, run through red lights, any kind of bad behavior while you're driving, the state can take your driver's license away because it's a privilege. It's not a right. You don't have a right to drive. It's a privilege to drive. And if you can't follow the rules, you lose that privilege. So I just want to make sure you understand the difference between a right and a privilege. Okay, a right can't be taken away from you. A privilege is usually conditional. You enjoy the use of it unless you break the rules, and then you lose the privilege. Okay, so this wheel is creaking, making all this noise. The coachman says, what gives you the right, or why do you think that it's okay for you to take such liberty to make all this noise? And the wheel says, from the beginning of time, creaking is the privilege of the weak. Creaking is the privilege of the weak. So the wheel is weak in the sense that it's got no ability to fix itself, right? If there's a problem with the wheel can't pull out a toolbox and repair itself. It's dependent on the help of others. It's dependent on the help of the coachman. So the wheel can't help itself, and that's what it really means to be weak. It means you're not able to do what you need to do. You need someone else to help you to do it. So when the weak have a problem, they can't solve their own problem. They have to appeal to someone who's stronger to help them. This is their privilege. They have the privilege to ask for help or to creak. So creaking here is symbolic. Let's stop playing around with the drawing. Just listen and pay attention or you're going to be removed. Just 1 minute. We can fix this real quick. Just a minute. All right. So the creaking of the wheel is not necessarily complaining, so don't take it in a negative way. It's just expressing a need for help or crying out for help. It's all that the wheel can do. It can ask for help. So creaking is the privilege of the weak. Okay, that's the moral. Creaking is the privilege of the weak. And we want to explain that a little more. So we want to say asking for help is the privilege of the weak. Asking for help is the privilege of the weak. And I want to talk about this a little bit because even though this is a short fable, it's actually a pretty deep lesson for us. One of the things that's difficult in our society, and you'll feel this more when you get older, not so much when you're a kid, but you'll run into people who are asking for help. You'll run into poor people who are asking if you'll give them some money. You may be driving and stop at a red light and someone walks up to your car and asks you for some money. And it can be very uncomfortable because you're not sure what you're supposed to do. Like, are you really supposed to just give some stranger money anytime they ask for it? And the answer to that question is no. There's a different, you notice that it says the privilege of the weak, the privilege of the weak. It's not a right of the weak to ask people for money. It's a privilege of the weak, and it's conditional. So for example, when we talk about poor people, a poor person is not just a person who doesn't have money. That's not what it means to be a poor. That's one kind of poor. But when we say you should help the poor, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are weak, who can't help themselves. So for example, if a person is born and they've got a physical problem, like they're crippled or something like that, that person is not going to be able to help himself. That's what it means to be weak. It means to be dependent on others for help. And it's not that person's fault. The person didn't do anything to put himself in that condition. He was born that way. And we have to ask the question, why does God allow people to be born that way? And the answer is because God has bigger plans for human life than just for everybody to be healthy and happy and wealthy and comfortable. God has bigger plans. God challenges us to love one another and to live in community. And he allows people to be born with all kinds of problems, not just physical problems, but mental problems, all kinds of problems. He allows this to happen because he invites us and gives us the opportunity to do good works and to merit eternal rewards for doing good works. So there are reasons why God allows these things to happen. When a person is born into the world weak, he is going to depend on the help of others. And that's why we, in the Catholic faith, we talk about the works of mercy. What it means to be merciful is to look at someone else who's weak and to realize that we didn't necessarily make ourselves strong. You know, I'm a strong, healthy person. I have perfect health almost every day of my life. There's nothing that I did to make myself healthy. Sure, I don't do bad things that might make me sick. You know, I don't smoke cigarettes or use drugs or drink alcohol excessively or anything like that. I could make myself sick, but I enjoy perfect health, and I didn't earn that health. God gives me that health. And so when I see someone who's sick, who's sick and it's not in their control, they were born with some kind of sickness, or they picked up some kind of sickness or disease in their life. When I look at them, I have to remember that I didn't make myself healthy, and they didn't necessarily make themselves sick. and I need to treat them the way that I would want someone to treat me if I was weak. And that's what it means to be merciful. So the poor, notice what it says, the weak have a privilege of creaking. The weak have a privilege. That means they have permission from God to ask for help. They have permission from God to ask for help. Who has that permission? The weak, the truly weak have that permission. So when we think about someone who's crippled or who has a mental problem, that person has from God the privilege, the permission to ask other people for help. And when they ask other people for help, they're not being a burden. They have the right to do that. I shouldn't say right, but they have the privilege to do that. They are allowed to ask people for help. And what Jesus taught us in the gospel is give to anyone who asks you. And he's talking about this situation. So when someone is weak and someone needs help and they ask us for help, we're supposed to do everything we can to give them some help. But that's because they're weak. There are other people who are poor, not because they're weak, but because they don't work, or they're immoral, or they injure themselves, and so on. They're poor because of their own sins, because sin will make you poor. You might say, I thought sin makes us rich. Well, sin might make you rich for a little bit of time, but ultimately, sinful activities usually lead to a crash and a fall, and you end up in a terrible situation. That's not weakness. That's not this kind of poverty. That's not good poverty. That's sinful poverty. If there's somebody who's poor because of his own sins, we're not supposed to help that person by giving them what they need. We're supposed to admonish them and help them to stop sinning and fix their lives, because the reason that they're poor is because of the way that they're living. And it's in their power to fix that. They're not weak. They're just being sinful. And the right response to those people is to help them to fix their lives. So they don't have a privilege to ask for help. They don't have the privilege because they're not weak. They don't have the privilege to ask for help. And that's why we do have to be discerning when people ask us for help, because there's two different kinds of people. And the problem with giving help to people who don't deserve it is that it takes up the resources, it takes up the money that you have that you could use to help people who actually are weak and do have a real need for that help. So one of the problems with giving to people who don't deserve help, who are not actually weak, is that they're taking money away from people who actually are weak and who need that help, and who have permission from God to ask and receive that help. So make sure that as you read this fable, you pay attention to the word weak and realize that there are people who are weak, sincerely weak, through no fault of their own, and they have the privilege, the permission from God himself, and usually from the state as well, to ask for help. And we have a duty to help them as much as we're able. But there are other people who are poor, and yet they're not weak, and they don't have this privilege. So we just want to make sure we get all these things clear, because this is confusing in life. Like I said, you'll often be asked by somebody to help, and it's very uncomfortable. You don't know what you should do in that situation. And this helps us to understand what the situation actually is. It's not good to refer to people as poor, because there's different ways people become poor. Some are poor because they're weak and can't work. Others are poor because they're bad and they've made themselves poor. So it's not good to talk about the poor. It's better, like Aesop does here, to talk about the weak and say, it's our duty to help the weak. It's not our duty to help the sinful poor. It's our duty to help the weak. And this guy over here, he's not weak. He just doesn't work. Or he's not weak. He just doesn't follow instructions. He's not weak. He's just a criminal. He's not weak. He's just sinful and wastes all of his resources. So that's the difference. So the weak have a privilege of creaking. there's a saying, you've probably heard this, that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You ever heard that saying? The squeaky wheel gets the grease. And what it means is that the wheel, by asking for help, the wheel that asks for help is the one that gets help. So even like, let's say in our studies, I'll often say, if there's something that you need, if you need a lesson or you're waiting for a quiz or you need help with something, tell me, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's the idea from this fable, right? It also applies to our spiritual life, because God asks us to pray for things. And this can be confusing too, because in the catechism, we'll learn something like God knows everything. God knows all your thoughts, even the secrets of your life that you think nobody else knows. God knows everything about your life. Jesus said he has all of the hairs of your head are numbered. And we learn that God knows all things. Okay, well, if God knows all things, then why do I have to pray? Why doesn't God just give me what I need? And the reason why is because God actually commands us to pray. He commands us to ask for things that we need. He commands us to pray. And why does he command us to pray? He commands us to pray because praying is humble. Just like he asks us to confess our sins. Why do I need to go to church and confess my sins to a priest when God already knows my sins? And he already knows if I'm sorry for my, why do I need to go confess my, because it takes humility and it teaches us honesty by making us go and confess our sins to a priest. So God is always concerned with more than just getting things done. He's also concerned with how things get done so that they have a better effect and actually make people better, make us better. So God requires us to pray. He wants us to creak. He wants us to realize that we are weak, we need his help, and when we need help, he wants us to creak. Because from the beginning of time, creaking is the privilege of the weak. One of the reasons people don't like to pray is because they don't like to admit that they're weak, and that's why they don't like to pray. They would rather try to do it themselves, or they'd rather just not have it and spite themselves in pride, so they don't have to humble themselves and pray. So we're getting into some applications and things like that. But again, the moral of this fable is that the weak have the privilege. It's okay for them to ask for help, to ask for alms. And if you don't know what alms are, in Christian teaching, you'll hear about alms, that we have a duty to give alms. Jesus says, when you give alms, and you say, what in the world are alms? The word alms just means merciful giving to people who are weak. That's what alms giving is. It means showing mercy to the weak. By giving alms means to give something to them. So giving alms is a necessary practice in the Christian life. Because the weak have the right to ask. What we earn, if I work and earn money, that money's not all mine. God doesn't give me that money just for myself. He gives me that money to take care of my own needs, but also to look around and see if anyone else needs help, and to be merciful and share with those who are weak. So we can see how this fable really helps us to think about life and realize that the weak people in the world, they have permission from God to ask for help, and we have a duty to give them that help because we're strong in a certain thing. We may be strong in one area and weak in another area. We may need to ask for help in our studies because we're not gifted with intellectual strength, but we may have some other area of life that we're strong in. And in that area, we need to be generous, and in another area, we need to be humble and ask for help. So we can learn a lot by meditating on this fable of the creaking wheel. Okay, so the weak, I should say, the weak have the privilege to creak. They have the right to ask for help. That's the moral of this story. As for an application, when you get to the application question, you can think of specific examples from your life. I don't want you to restate the moral. I don't want you to say the moral of this lesson is that the weak have the privilege of asking for help. And then you go down to the application and you say, this fable will help me to ask for help. Like that's not what the application question is for. All right. The application question is for you to think of some specific situation, some specific example of where you can take this general moral lesson and apply it to your life in a specific way, in a way that's unique to your own life. So, for example, you could talk about how, an application of this fable is that if you feel that you're weak in a certain thing, and it's not just because you're lazy, but it's because you really are weak, you're not going to be prideful, but you're going to ask for help and not make excuses. You're going to humble yourself, admit that you're weak in this one area, and ask for help. And again, people are going to usually challenge you to make sure you're not being lazy. Like if you write a question to me and ask me for help, my first response is going to be to push back and say, you need to study. You need to stop being lazy and try harder to learn this lesson. But then as we continue to talk, a person who is sincere is going to continue to ask for help. So that initial pushback is usually to chase away fakers who are just being lazy. And someone who has real need is going to continue to ask for help. So if you do find yourself weak, you need to humble yourself and ask for help. That's why making excuses is bad. Usually people make excuses when they're too prideful to ask for help. They would rather just make an excuse and be told that they don't have to do it. That's why excuses are bad. But a good person who finds that they're not able to do something won't quit, won't make excuses. They'll ask for help. And that's why good people pray. God asks us to do things that are really impossible. And so there are two different responses. We can say, this is impossible. I can't do this, so I'm just going to quit. Well, that's what a sinful person does. They use it as an excuse. But that's not what a good person does. A good person will say, God asks me to do this. I can't do that. Therefore, I need to ask for help. That's what a good person will do. So we have to learn to not be ashamed of creaking and asking for help. And you can think of some specific way in which you need to ask somebody for help, and it's difficult because it's humiliating sometimes, but you have to learn to be humble and ask for help rather than make excuses. Or you can think of an example where someone was in need and asked you for help, and that you did help them or chose not to help them because they were weak or they weren't actually weak. So it's easy to start thinking of some applications for that. So that's the fable of the creaking wheel. The moral of the fable is that the weak have permission from God to ask for help, and we have an obligation, assuming that we're strong, we have an obligation to help them. And then as for applications, how you can identify a weakness in your life and ask for help in that area, and who you would ask for help from in that area, or if you're strong in a certain area and you had the opportunity to help someone or have the opportunity to help someone, why you think it's right for you to help that person, that they actually are weak. Okay, so that's the fable of the creaking wheel. I think that one's pretty clear for us. So it's a short fable, but there's a lot of really good content in that fable that we can meditate on and draw some wisdom from. So that's the creaking wheel. The next fable here, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second and reshare my screen. I think I can get rid of that junk that was drawn on the screen. Yeah. The next fable, just the next one in the book, is The Mouse and the Weasel. The Mouse and the Weasel. This one's a little longer. Let's see, anybody want to read this for us? You guys are like ready. You guys are ready to read. Let's see, Lawrence asked if he could read. I'll give him a chance to read. Let me find Lawrence in here. Where are you at, Lawrence? I think I see your head there. There you are. I see you. Go ahead and unmute.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. So
Okay.
go ahead. The Mouse and the Weasel. Just take your time. Take your time. Read it nice and clearly. Nice and clearly. Go ahead.
A lean and a hungry mouse went his way, not without some trouble, through a small hole in a into a corn hut,
Mhm.
and there fed for some time so busy that when he would have returned by the same way that he entered, he found himself too plump to get through the hole, pushed as hard as he might. A weasel who had great fun in watching the vain struggles of the fat little thing called to him and said, "Listen to me, my plump friend. There is one way to get out, and that is to wait till you have become as lean as when you first got in."
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so we've got this fable of the mouse and the weasel. We've got a mouse and a weasel as the two characters. We're told at the beginning of the fable that it's a lean and hungry mouse. We've got this skinny little mouse. Not only is it a small mouse, it's a scrawny little hungry mouse. And so this mouse is able to move around and get into small holes because he's lean and hungry. But it's important to note that his size, because he's lean and hungry, his size is not the normal mouse size. So he has to be careful. He ends up pushing his way, even though he's small. He found the hole that was small that he could get into, but he had to push through even while he was scrawny. And he pushes his way through this hole with trouble, it says, into a corn hutch. That means like a shed that the farmers would put the corn in to keep it dry, keep it out of the weather. He sneaks into this corn hutch, and there it says he feeds for some time so busily that when he would have returned out the same hole that he got into, he found himself too plump, too fat to get through the hole, no matter how hard he pushes. So he got himself stuck inside this corn crib or this corn hutch. Got in while he was small, ate until he was big and fat, and then was stuck. So then a weasel comes along, and a weasel was entertaining himself watching this silly fat little thing, it says. And he calls out to the mouse and says, "Listen to me, my plump friend. There is only one way to get out. There's only one way to get out, and that is to wait until you have become as lean as when you first got in." And that's the fable of the mouse and the weasel. Okay, so let's think about this fable. And again, pay attention so you can learn this moral and get this fable assignment done as easily as possible. So we've got a small mouse, and he pushes himself into a hole that really nature doesn't intend for him to enter into. Nature doesn't intend for him to enter into this small hole, but he pushes himself through. And then when he gets into this small hole, or through this small hole, he thinks that he's hit the jackpot, and he's got this whole crib full of corn all to himself to just chew away on. And as he does so, he gets big and fat as a result of all of this eating. And then he finds that he's stuck and in trouble, and he's not able to escape. He's not able to get back out. The problem is, the only way, since he snuck into this place when he was in a condition that wasn't natural, he snuck in when he was very small because he was hungry and skinny. The only way that he's going to get out is to wait until he returns to that same condition. So he's going to have to sit there and wait until his body uses up all of that energy from all of that food that he ate. And he's hungry again and scrawny again, so he can get out the hole. And what's interesting is the first time when he was scrawny in the beginning, he was scrawny because he didn't have any food. So he didn't necessarily make himself scrawny by any kind of, self-discipline or self-denial. He was hungry because there was no food. Now, think about what he's got to do now. In order to get out of this place, he's going to have to not eat anymore and wait until his body is small enough to get out. And he's going to have to avoid eating while he's in the midst of a corn crib, which is going to be very difficult. So he's really stuck in a difficult situation. And the only way for him to get out is to now have to go back to his skinny state, but to do so in a much more difficult condition, because he's got to do it in the presence of all of this food. And it actually is going to be very hard for him to lose this weight, get back to his skinny little size, so he can slip back through this hole. Okay, so what's the moral of this fable? Well, there's a bunch of moral lessons in this fable. But I think the main moral lesson that this fable teaches is to be careful that you don't get yourself into a situation that you can't get out of. Be careful that you don't get yourself into a situation that you can't get yourself out of. And we do this kind of thing all the time. And I'll talk about some applications of this. So let's just think about the details of this story, okay? If I'm a farmer, I grow all of this corn on my farm, and then I have to store it for the winter. So I build a corn hutch, which is like a big shed that's raised up off the ground so it can't get wet. And I store all of my corn for the winter in this corn crib. And now, if you've never been around farming, you might not really know what it means by corn, because if you live in a town and get corn from the supermarket, you always get fresh corn, or you get corn in a can, and it's like soft and sweet corn. But that's not the kind of corn that farmers grow. What farmers grow is a field corn, and what they do is they grow the corn in the field during the summer, and they leave it there to dry out. And in the fall, when it's time to harvest the corn is usually hard and dry, like when you get popcorn. You know, when you get popcorn and you buy a bag of the hard kernels, that's what the corn is like when the farmers bring it out of the field, and they put it into a shed for the winter where it's kept dry. And they usually use that corn not for themselves to eat, but they usually use it as animal feed, and they feed it to the animals hard, and the animals just chew it up and eat it because the animals don't care. Sometimes people will use that corn, they'll grind it into flour, and they can use the flour to make cornbread and things like that. So don't think wet, sweet, juicy corn on the cob or corn in a can or anything like that. Think hard, dry popcorn. Okay, that's what the farmer has stored in this corn shed. And when the farmer does that, the farmer knows that the corn is going to be in danger of bugs and mice getting into the corn. So he'll make sure that not only is that corn crib up off the ground so it can't get wet, but he'll check it out and make sure that there's no holes or anything for any mice or rats or bugs to get into. So the farmer will make sure that there's no holes in the corn crib. But in this corn crib, there was a hole, but the farmer probably didn't pay attention to it because it was too small for a mouse to get in, the normal size mouse to get in. So he didn't worry about it. And so this mouse comes across this corn crib, and he would be expecting not to find any way into this corn crib, but he finds this one small hole which no other mice could get in. And because he's so skinny and hungry, he's able to squeeze his way through that hole and get into this corn crib. And when he does that, you can imagine that he thinks he's just so clever. You know, he's so slick. He can sneak his way into this corn crib that the farmer wants to keep mice out of. So he thinks he's so smart because he gets himself into this situation. And then when he's in that situation, you can imagine him inside that corn crib just pigging out, right? Just having a feast, you know, laying there with a big fat belly, you know, after he eats to his full, and he's in paradise. There's no other mice in there. He's got no competition. He's in there all by himself. And then all of a sudden he starts to realize, you know, I'm awfully thirsty in here. I really need a drink. And there's no water in here, so I'm going to have to get out of this place to get a drink, and then he realizes, uh-oh, I can't get out of here. I'm stuck. So now he's stuck in this corn crib, and there's no way out. And so we see that the moral of the story is, be careful that you don't get yourself into a situation that you can't get yourself out of. And you can see the moral is, don't think that you're slick because you can sneak into a situation that you're not supposed to be in, and then not thinking about what might happen in that situation, you find yourself stuck in it. So we can think of other stories, like we can think of a story like someone sneaking into a store when the store is about to close and getting locked in the store, something like that, or sneaking into somebody's room to try and get something, and all of a sudden the person comes home and now you're stuck, you're trapped in their room and you're in trouble and there's no way out. So you can imagine all of these different situations where you can sneak your way into something and think that you're going to, enjoy something and get away with it, but then all of a sudden you find yourself trapped and there's no way out. So this mouse gets himself into that situation, thinking that he's got a good situation and finding that he's actually got himself into a bad situation. The only way that he can get himself out of it is to go back to his original condition and get back out that hole. But the problem is now it's very difficult to get himself back into that original condition. And this is another problem. Another moral lesson of this fable is that when we sneak ourselves or squeeze ourselves into situations that we shouldn't get into, it's hard for us to get out of them. It's hard for us to get out of them. And I'll give you a good application of this. You may hear about times when people say that they're addicted to a drug. You can say, oh, this person is addicted to this drug. So this person had a problem, just like this mouse had a problem. This person had a problem. Usually people use drugs because they have problems and they're trying to deal with those problems, and the drugs give them some, what they think is help with their problems. For example, they may be sick. They may be in lots of pain because they have a disease, and they turn to drugs because the drugs they take away the pain and they allow them to be able to get away from the pain for a little while. But the way that our bodies work, when you start taking drugs, your body gets used to the drug and your body starts to need more drugs and need more drugs and need more drugs to have that effect. And then the next thing you know, you have to take so much of the drug that you can't stop thinking about it. You can't stop seeking it because you need a lot of it. And you find yourself trapped in this place that we call addiction, where you're no longer just in control of the thing, but now this habit has sort of taken over your whole life. And you're like this mouse stuck in the corn crib. And it's not easy to get out of it. Now, you might say, if a person gets addicted to a drug, are they guilty of like the sins that they commit when they're addicted? Like we hear stories about someone who gets addicted to a drug and then kind of goes crazy and like starts robbing people or stealing things or even killing people. And we say, oh, well, he's a drug addict. Is he guilty for those things, or is addiction, like, does that excuse him? And what Aristotle teaches about that is that when the person first starts using the drug or the alcohol, that person makes those decisions freely. And the consequences of those decisions at some point can become out of the person's control. But because that person made the first free decisions to enter into that situation, that person is responsible for everything that comes later because he got himself into that situation. So when we look at this mouse, we see an example of a person like that who chooses to get into a situation and then finds himself trapped in that situation. And now there's no way out. There's no way out except to go back to your original condition. And you can imagine, like, again, using this example of a person who's addicted to drugs, they had a problem in the beginning, like they had pain, or they were depressed, or they were angry, or they were lonely, whatever their problem might be. And they sought to comfort themselves and find an escape from their problems by drinking alcohol or by using drugs or something. There's lots of other things. We can get ourselves addicted to food because we use food as a source of comfort in a way that's not necessary for us. And so they get themselves into a problem, and then it's very, very difficult to now think that in order to get out of this problem, you're going to have to go back to your original condition, back where you came from. And that's why people who get addicted often don't want to get fixed, because they don't want to go back to that original condition because they were in pain, or they were sad, or they were lonely, or they were afraid of things, or they were angry, whatever. They don't want to go back to that condition. And so now they're in a real difficult situation. And that's what we find this mouse in. He's stuck in a real difficult situation. So now he's got to choose to deny himself all of this corn and go back voluntarily to his hungry, scrawny, skinny state so he can get out of this hole and get out of this trouble. The only way that he can get out of this trouble is to go back to his original state. And you can see why that's difficult. When you get yourself into that situation, it's very difficult to get back out of it. And usually in life, very few people do get out of it. And again, it's not just drugs, not just alcohol, it's any kind of pleasure. You can take things like reading books, and you could say, well, you're supposed to be doing these studies, or you're supposed to be doing these chores, or you're supposed to be doing this work. And instead of doing those things because you get tired, or you get bored or whatever, you like to just go and run away with some silly book to read. And you get yourself so into silly books that you can no longer concentrate and study real studies. And you get yourself stuck in this habit. And now you're so used to how good it feels to just lazily enjoy these silly stories that it's hard for you to get back to the original discipline that you had. It's even harder now than it was in the beginning. It's harder. The same thing could happen with video games. It's why your parents probably, if you play video games, your parents probably give you lots of warnings. And one of the reasons why you love video games so much is just they're just fun and relaxing. It's easy. It's not work. You probably don't sweat too much when you're playing video games. You don't have to actually do anything. You just sit there, fiddling around with the controller, and it's fun. It's relaxing. It's easy. It's pleasurable. That's why kids love it so much. Even adults do it, and they get themselves in trouble often. But there's a reason why we like it. We like it because it's pleasing and it's easy and it's relaxing. And the work that we have to do, the responsible work that we have to do, is hard. It's difficult. It's confusing. It's competitive. There's a lot of it to do, and we get tired. And so you can see how, you turn to something like a video game for a break and some recreation, which is good. But it's very easy to have that recreation turn into some kind of obsession. And then you get yourself so used to what it feels like to just be immersed in that game for, hours even. And it gets more and more and more difficult to get back to that work. And so your situation actually gets worse. You're like this mouse. You're like this fat mouse stuck in the corn crib. And now you can't get back out because you've gotten yourself used to this kind of life and experience that it's very difficult to get out of. And that's why we've got to be careful. So let's consider what the real lesson is of this fable. It's that if you're in a bad situation, and by bad, I don't mean morally bad, I mean just a situation that you might not like this mouse. He's hungry. It's a bad situation. He's hungry. Or a bad situation, you're in pain, or you're sad, or you're lonely, or you're bored, or you're tired from your work. We're tempted in those situations, we're tempted to seek a solution that we shouldn't seek. We're tempted, like this mouse, to squeeze through a hole and get ourselves into a situation that we really shouldn't get into. And when we do that, to try to get away from the difficulty of something we don't necessarily like, we're tempted to do that. And if we do it, it's like a trap that we might not be able to get ourselves out of. And that's why it's dangerous and we have to be careful. That's why if you read the saints and learn about the lives of saints, the saints always lived very simple lives. They ate very simple, they dressed very simple, they lived in very simple conditions. And they did that on purpose because of this fable, because of this idea. They knew that if they didn't keep their life always simple, they could be tempted into a situation where they got stuck in that situation. And the way to keep themselves free, the way to keep themselves safe, is to not allow themselves to be tempted to get into that situation by always committing to living a simple life intentionally, voluntarily. In Christian teaching, we call this voluntary poverty. Voluntary poverty, where you choose to keep your life simple so that you don't get stuck in a situation like this mouse. You don't get trapped in a place where you've gotten yourself into something and you've fattened yourself up, as it were, to use that illustration. You got yourself fattened up and now you can't get out and you're in an even more dangerous situation. So that's the warning of this fable of the mouse and the weasel. Be careful that you don't try to escape a problem by getting yourself into, and imagine what a fantasy world this is for this mouse, right? To have this whole shed full of corn to himself, desiring things, coveting things that are beyond what we need, is usually not going to turn out well. You're going to have bigger problems in the end, like this mouse. So that's the fable of the mouse and the weasel. We see the moral of the story is to be careful that you don't try to get away from a problem by getting yourself into a situation that you get stuck in. Be careful of temptations to do that. And then applications of this, there's a million applications. You can think of how you have, tried to get out of a problem and got yourself into a different situation that it was really difficult to get yourself out of, and you had to go through some hard experience to get yourself out of this problem. I think we can even say that the Christian life is sort of like this mouse's experience. We choose to disobey God, and we abandon God through our sins, and then we go into the world and we get ourselves fattened up like this mouse, and it's difficult for us to get back where we belong because all of the fattening up that we've done in our life actually becomes a hindrance to us, and it's harder to get back to where we were in the beginning than it would have been just to stay there in the first place. So we have to be careful of these temptations to pursue things that are going to fatten us up and make it difficult for us to get out when we do get fattened up. So that's the fable of the mouse and the weasel. So we covered two fables today, the creaky wheel and the mouse and the weasel. I don't really know what the weasel has to do with this fable other than just providing us with some commentary. I don't know if weasels eat mice, so I'm sure the weasel would not be too happy that the mouse got himself fattened up because weasel can't get him anyway, but maybe just because the weasel is an enemy of mice. I really don't know what weasels eat. But I think he's just in there as a second character to comment on the situation. But that's the fable of the mouse and the weasel. So I hope that's helpful. It's already 1:54, so we've used up all of our time. So I hope you got those details of those two fables. Take some time as soon as you can to go get those assignments done while it's all still fresh in your head, and we can move through this course on Aesop's Fables pretty quickly. My desire for you as students is that by the time you get into high school age, you can sort of move out of Aesop's Fables and get into Aristotle's Ethics. So I'd like to try to help you get through these fables as quickly as you can. So get these assignments done. And if there's anything else you need help with, let me know. You say weasels are thin there. Weasels are thin that they can squeeze through small holes. I don't know if the weasel got into this hole or not, or if he's outside. I think in the picture that's drawn in the book, I can't tell if they're inside or outside there. So I'm not sure what that is. So anyway, you could think about that on your own. And if you come up with a good solution to that problem, what's the role of this weasel? Share it with me when you write on the characters in your assignment, okay? That's it for today. If you've got any questions you want to ask, you can hang out for a few minutes and we can chat. Otherwise, you're free to go. And I'll see you tomorrow or next time whenever you're back for another live class, okay? I hope that's helpful. God bless everybody. Take care. All right, Jude, you asked if I can do the man who had two wives. Do you have time right now to talk about that? Let me see, you can unmute yourself here.
Yeah, I have time.
Okay, so that's the man and the two wives. Let me just find that in my book here. Just a second. How are you doing today, Jude?
Good.
Good. And I see a couple other guys. Who else is in here? Daniel? Daniel, you can open up your microphone too if you want to. Since it's just three of us left here.
Okay, thank you.
How are you doing today, Daniel?
Doing okay.
Good. All right, so we're gonna go over this man and the two wives real quick. Daniel, I don't know if you did this one yet, but if you pay attention, you can get this one done too, okay?
Okay, but I think I finished this lesson.
Okay, good. Well, maybe I'll ask you for some help then. So the man and his two wives. Jude, why don't you read the fable for us?
Okay.
And Daniel, you can
where
read
is it?
whenever you want, bud.
Where is it?
Oh,
wait, should
sorry.
I pull it up myself?
No. I've got it right here.
No.
Here you go. Sorry about that.
Yeah. In a country where men could not have more than one wife, a certain man whose head was fast becoming white had two, and a little older than himself, and one much younger. The young wife, being a gray and lively turn, did not want people to think she had an old man for a husband, so she used to pull out as many of his white hairs as she could. The old wife, on the other hand, did not wish to seem older than her husband, and so used to pull out the black hairs. This went on until between them both they made the poor man quite bald.
All right, very good. So we've got this man. And he's got two wives. One wife is older than him. She's like an old lady, and his other wife is a young lady. So the old lady looks at her husband and she sees he's got some gray hair. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The old lady looks at her husband, the old wife, and she's got gray hair, she's getting older, and she looks at her husband and see he's got this young black hair. And so she's kind of jealous, and she doesn't want to feel like he's younger than her. So what she does is she starts pulling out all of his younger colored hairs, so he looks older like her. And then he's also got the other wife who's younger than him, and she looks at her husband and says, I don't want a husband with all these gray hairs. So she starts pulling out all the gray hairs. And by the time the two wives are done, there's no hair left. And so this poor guy's left with no hair. And that's the story. And then we ask, what's the moral of this fable? The moral of the fable, there's a good Bible verse for this. You can't serve two masters, right? the Bible verse, you can't serve two masters. And this is why you can't serve two masters, because they're going to demand different things from you, and they're going to be pulling you in two different directions, and you're going to end up not making either of them happy because they're both going to be frustrated. And so that's what this man learns the hard way. He learns that it's impossible to serve two different masters or two different critics who are going to demand different things of you. And what's going to happen if you try to do that is you're going to end up with nothing. That's the moral of this fable. Okay? You understand that? Okay. So, and then you have to think of an application, right? An application, obviously you're not going to talk about being married to two women or something like that. That's the fable. That's not the application. The application is, you might think about in your life, if there's any way in your life where there's different people who you might try to please, who want you to do different things, and it's going to be impossible to please both of them, right? You're going to have to choose. You're going to have to choose to please one of them and not please the other. That's just how life works. That's why it's hard to be a Christian in the first place, is because in order to please God, we're going to have to displease lots of people. And that's how it feels in our life. It's impossible to make everybody happy. And a lot of times we would like to make everybody happy. We would, if I could avoid trouble with people, I would like to avoid trouble, but sometimes it's just impossible, and we've got to choose, or else we're going to be torn apart. And so we've got to make decisions sometimes to choose to please one person or choose to do something that's good for one purpose, and realize that we're going to have to give up something else. When we do that, we're going to have to give up another person who's going to be angry, for example, because we didn't do what they wanted us to do. And so it's impossible to serve two opposite masters that want different things. We're going to have to choose to serve one and ignore the other. And a good application is that this just applies to the Christian life. You should desire to please good people in your life, and there are going to be bad people around you that put pressure on you to do what they want. And if you try to please both, you try to have friends that are bad, and then you also try to be good with the good, you're just going to end up having nothing and getting into trouble, where you're going to have to choose one of them. You're going to have to choose one of them. And what a smart person would do is to choose the good person, to choose to try to please the wise person or the good person. And if anybody's going to be unhappy with you, let it be the bad people. Let them be unhappy, right? But don't make the good people unhappy. Don't make God unhappy. Let the bad people be unhappy. So you're going to have to choose. And I think you can think of some examples from that would make for good applications. Okay. You got that? So hopefully that's helpful. Does that answer that question for you? Help with that fable?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, good. So so now that we've talked about it, try to work on that while it's fresh in your head, okay? So you can get that done.
Okay.
Yeah, so the moral is pretty simple, right? You can't please everybody. You can't please opposite people. And the application is to think of some examples where you might have to do that, and you have to choose one and choose not to do the other, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so that's good. The man and his two wives. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Daniel, how about you? Did you need any help with anything here?
I need only a little bit of help right now because I didn't connect last week because I was late for the meeting.
Okay. So you're like the creaky wheel, huh?
Yep.
So you're here creaking today. All right. So you weren't able to make your meeting last week. So what, you didn't get to go through your planner, or what?
I didn't get to go through my planner, but I kind of submitted a couple. And also Miss Dana also helped me with a little bit of the lessons too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what did you need help with?
Well, what I need help is that I want to know what lesson was last week.
Well, you mean what, Fables?
Fable, yeah.
Well, this week we did what did I do? I did the Creaking Wheel, Let me just find where this is in the course. Give me 1 second. I'll find it. Let me open up Study Center. Give me 1 minute. I'll see where it is. Aesop's Fables. And we're looking for, it's down by like 85. 85. Last week we did 85 and 86. The mice in council and the mountain in labor. Okay.
Okay.
So that's what we did last week. And I think, let me just see if I put that video. Let me see if I put the video up last week. It will be last Monday. Was that the, yeah, is that the 18th? I don't know. Let's just see what this is real quick. This is the, no, that's not the right one. I don't know if I put that video up last week.
Yeah. Well, actually, I also looked and it didn't have it too.
Yeah,
It
so
didn't.
let me take a look. Maybe I just didn't upload it. I might have it, but I didn't upload it. And if I didn't save it, I'll just record a new one for you, okay? And I'll post it on the course page, all right?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I'll work on
Thank
that.
you, Mr. Michael. Bye.
All right, take care.
All right, thank you. Bye.